At first glance, Arthur seemed like the last person anyone would suspect of being a serial killer. From the outside, he looked like a perfect father and husband, and it was that impeccable camouflage that allowed him to murder hundreds of people across several states for decades without ever tipping off the authorities. In fact, if it weren't for the unmatched skill and incredibly keen eye of Special Agent Frank Lundy, Trinity may have kept killing until his body broke down from old age. Hard to believe any killer could get that lucky for so long, but it's the efficiency of Trinity's process that would keep him free and undetected, not luck. So today we are breaking down the Trinity killer's entire ritual, stage by stage, to see how it actually works and why it works so damn well. Before you understand Trinity's ritual, you have to understand his backstory. The origins of the man who would become the Trinity killer can be traced back to a deeply traumatic childhood. Before he became a methodical murderer terrorizing the country, Arthur Mitchell grew up in a household defined by fear, violence, and emotional neglect. His early life was shaped by an insanely dysfunctional family dynamic where protection and support were nowhere to be found. Seriously, I wouldn't wish his childhood on my worst enemy. For starters, Arthur's father, Henry Mitchell, was a harsh, domineering man who struggled with alcohol for as long as Arthur could remember. When he drank, his already explosive temper became even more dangerous and everyone suffered for it. He would constantly lash out and abuse his family, ruling the entire house through intimidation and physical violence. Rather than offering any form of stability, Henry created an environment where fear was a daily reality. Then there was Arthur's mother, Marcia, who was either unable or unwilling to protect her children from their father's violence. She may have hated her children just as much as Henry did, or maybe she just didn't care either way. She could have felt powerless or simply overwhelmed by the situation, and that's why she did so little to intervene when her husband's cruelty escalated. She could have taken her children and ran, but she never so much as lifted a finger to keep them safe. As a result, Arthur and his sister were left to navigate their chaotic home life without any real emotional support, and it all clearly had a major effect on Arthur. There were signs that something about him was off. He exhibited disturbing and troubling behavior from early on in life. He clearly struggled with boundaries and empathy, and at some point, that boiled over in the worst way. One evening, he secretly watched his older sister Vera while she was showering. When Vera noticed him standing in the bathroom doorway, she panicked. Startled and violated, she slipped inside the shower and broke the glass door. The shattered glass cut her femoral artery badly enough that she began bleeding uncontrollably. Tragically, she died there in the bathtub before anyone could save her. The horrifying accident left Arthur overwhelmed with guilt. In his mind, his disturbing behavior had directly caused his sister's death, and Vera's death only made life inside the Mitchell home even worse. Instead of receiving help or guidance to cope with this trauma, Arthur was left completely alone with his guilt. His parents offered no emotional support or counseling that might have helped him process what happened in a healthy way. The tragedy became yet another gaping wound within an already irreparably broken household, and things only got worse from there. Not long after Vera's death, the family suffered another devastating loss. Unable to cope with the grief of losing her daughter, Marcia Mitchell eventually took her own life by jumping from the Collins Canal Bridge. Her suicide shattered what little stability remained in the household. Arthur's father responded to the family's latest tragedy with even more anger and alcohol-fueled violence. Henry blamed Arthur for everything that had happened, saying that it was his son who was responsible for the destruction of their family. He shamed Arthur for peeping on his sister, calling him a little pervert, saying he killed her. With the accusations, the abuse grew even more severe. Beatings Arthur endured became even more frequent and far more extreme. The emotional torment was getting to be too much. Arthur could barely function living under the weight of everything that happened, especially as things with his father spiraled even further out of control. Eventually, the violence pushed Arthur to his breaking point. After years of suffering at his father's hands, he fought back. One night outside a bar, Arthur attacked his father, bludgeoning him to death. But luckily for Arthur, there were no witnesses and the murder was never solved. And with his father gone, Arthur was completely alone. His sister was dead, his mother had taken her own life, and he had killed the man who abused him for years. That combination of guilt, trauma, and freshly tapped rage shaped Arthur into the murderous maniac he soon became. That tragic upbringing formed the foundation for the ritualistic killings that made Trinity the most terrifyingly effective killer in the series. But what exactly was that ritual? First, remember that Arthur Mitchell's ritual was far more complex than the authorities initially realized. Trinity got his name because Lundy thought the killer always struck in sets of 3. What investigators eventually learned, however, was that the killer followed a carefully constructed cycle made up of 4 distinct murders, and each stage of the ritual represented one of the major traumatic moments from Arthur's childhood, recreating the tragedies that shattered his family. To him, these killings and his ritual were deeply personal. they recreated the pain that defined his entire life. Every victim and every part of his process represented another step in his ascent into madness. For the first step in his ritual, Arthur used charity work as the perfect cover for his movements. Through a program that built homes for families in need, he traveled with volunteers to construction sites in different communities across America. To everyone around him, he appeared to be a generous man, devoted to helping the less fortunate. In reality, those build sites were where his entire cycle kicked off. At these construction sites, Arthur would abduct a young boy, hold him hostage for a few days, and eventually bury him alive in the cement foundation of the home being built. The evidence was always hidden beneath layers of concrete that would later support a family's house, meaning the crime would stay undiscovered forever. And before he sealed the boy's fate, Arthur performed a disturbing series of preparations. He would take the child to a private location and force him to wear a specific pair of pajamas. He would sit and eat with the boy and play with a model train set, acting as though the child was there voluntarily. He would listen to his favorite record and repeatedly call the boy Arthur, refusing to acknowledge the child's real name or identity. This horrifying ritual was meant to symbolize the moment Arthur believed he lost his own innocence as a child. By forcing the boy to assume his identity, he was attempting to recreate and preserve the version of himself that existed before Vera died and his family fell apart completely. In Arthur's twisted mind, this part of the ritual served both as a memorial to his lost innocence and a way to hold on to it forever. Again, at the time, the only person who was actively tracking or even believed in the existence of the Trinity killer was Lundy. But Lundy had no idea that these buried children were part of the killer's ritual. In each city where Trinity operated, there had been reports of a missing boy, but Lundy only thought to look into murders that fit the pattern he had picked up on, not disappearances. And all of the victims in that pattern were adults, not children. Since the cases of the missing boys did not match the established murder sequence, he never connected them to the Trinity case. The truth only came to light because of Dexter. While stalking Arthur with the intention of eventually killing him, Dexter witnessed him abducting a young boy from an arcade. He immediately knew something was off and fought against the clock to find out what Arthur was planning to do with the kid he took. Dexter was able to figure out that there was a missing boy in each city Trinity hit, and that he chose the location based on where the four walls builds would be happening. He knew which construction site Arthur planned to use for the burial and followed him. Dexter arrived just in time, intervening before the child could be permanently locked away in the cement. By rescuing the boy, Dexter interrupted the very first stage of Trinity's ritual. Had he arrived any later, the boy would have sunken too deeply and the concrete could have dried, allowing Arthur to calmly move on with his sick cycle. After successfully kicking off a cycle with the murder of the young boy, Arthur immediately switched gears to the second stage of the ritual. Like the other parts of his pattern, this murder was not at all random. It was carefully staged to mirror another tragedy from his childhood. Each detail of this murder was designed to recreate the emotional trauma he associated with the death of his sister. To carry out this stage, Arthur would first identify a young woman who was single and lived alone. This allowed him to enter the home without drawing attention or risking interference from family members, roommates, or anyone else. Once he selected his target, he would break into the house while she was away and make his way to the bathroom. There, he would prepare the setting for the ritual. Arthur would fill the bathtub with water, remove all of his clothes, and lay in wait for the woman to come home. Arthur remained completely silent, hidden within the bathroom, as he anticipated the moment when the woman came in there. And of course, eventually, she would walk in and discover the stranger lurking in her bathroom. Before the woman could escape or even really react, Arthur would overpower her. He would strip off her clothing and forcibly drag her into the bathtub with him. Once both of them were in the water, the murder itself would unfold in a very specific way. Arthur used a straight edge blade to cut the woman high on the thigh, deliberately severing only her femoral artery. Just like with Vera, the injury would cause rapid and catastrophic blood loss. Rather than finishing the victim quickly, Arthur allowed her to slowly bleed out in the tub. During those final moments, he would lie beneath her body in the water, watching closely as the woman's life slipped away. One of the most disturbing elements of this ritual involved a small mirror that Arthur held up to the victim's face. He watched her reflection carefully, watching the light in her eyes gradually fade away as she died. It forced him to confront the moment of death directly, like he was witnessing his sister's death all over again. But this time, he could comfort her. Arthur would stroke his victim's hair, tell them not to struggle, saying it was, quote, already over. When the woman finally died, Arthur left her body exactly where it was, floating in a bath of bloody water for police to discover later. Arthur's sister was only 16 years old when she died. By targeting very young adult women who lived alone, Arthur attempted to recreate the emotional circumstances surrounding that loss as closely as possible, while still ensuring he could commit the crime without interruption or be linked to any investigation later on. The victims themselves were not important to him as individuals. What mattered was their role in reenacting his personal trauma. The women weren't human to him, just necessary pieces of the same puzzle he was stuck putting together over and over again. After the murder was done, he did something that made it all the more disturbing. He would take a long shower using dangerously hot water and cry loudly. He would use water so extremely hot that it even burned his skin. This was a form of self-punishment. In Arthur's mind, the scalding hot water allowed him to take responsibility for causing Vera's death. It was what he deserved. He hated himself for what happened to Vera, and the pain of the hot water made him pay for what he did to her. He saw himself as bad, and he was raised to believe that when someone did something bad, they had to be harshly punished. For Arthur, every step of the process had meaning. Part 1, the murder, recreated the death, of course, and Part 2, burning himself in the shower, represented his remorse and desire to atone for his sin. As a deeply religious man, the shower probably represented hellfire as well. Arthur never forgave himself and probably believed God never would either. Thus, the cycle had to continue. And that meant shifting to the third stage of the ritual. After he reprocessed the loss of his sister, the next victim in Trinity's cycle represented the death of his mother. Arthur's target for this stage was always a very specific type of person, a normal, unassuming mother with exactly 2 children. Before acting, he would carefully observe potential victims in public places such as parks, grocery stores, or school pickup areas. His goal was to confirm that the woman truly had 2 children to match the structure of his own family during childhood. Once he verified this detail, the woman would become his next victim. After identifying the target, Arthur would locate the woman's home and plan the abduction. At some point when she was alone, he would confront her and force her into her own car. Rather than immediately killing her, he compelled the woman to drive while he sat behind her, controlling every movement. To prevent any chance of escape, Arthur would zip tie one of her hands directly to the steering wheel. This cruel method ensured that she could not easily flee the vehicle or fight back without losing control of the car, which could kill them both. Arthur would have the woman drive to a predetermined location, usually a tall building or structure with a rooftop that could be accessed without attracting much attention. The drive itself was a terrifying ordeal for the victim. She had no way of knowing where she was being taken or what Arthur intended to do when they got there. But what was in store for her after the trip was far worse. Once they arrived, he would force the woman out of the car and escort her up to the top of the building. At the rooftop, the ritual reached a sickening point psychologically. Arthur did not push the victim or throw her from the edge of the building. Instead, he demanded that she jump on her own. He insisted that the woman willingly step off the building of her own accord, just like he believed his mother did. Remember, he was convinced that he was responsible for his mother's suicide too. If his mother really had taken her own life because she was crushed by the grief from Vera's death, which he definitely believed was his fault, then that meant he carried the burden of both their deaths. All of the years of his father aggressively blaming him for what happened to their family broke something inside of Arthur. The blame became yet another defining part of his life that he could never move on from. These feelings of guilt, shame, and resentment all mixed together and propelled Trinity to the final stage of the ritual. And with the recreation of his mother's death finally finished, Arthur was ready to move on to the last and most personal kill in his deadly cycle. The final stage of Arthur's ritual was the only part that law enforcement truly understood for a long time. The bludgeonings were the only part of the ritual that actually looked like murders. So these were the only ones ever investigated, and even then, nothing was ever found and none of the attacks were ever connected. Most importantly, there was definitely no way for investigators to know that these killings were just the last step in the much larger cycle of violence that Arthur had been wreaking for over 30 years. Just like the woman he chose earlier in the cycle, the final victim was carefully chosen to mirror the structure of Arthur's childhood family. He made sure that the man he targeted always had 2 children, just like the jumper. Arthur would stalk potential victims for as long as he needed to, quietly observing their routines until he felt confident he understood their daily habits well enough to pull off the attack. Once he gathered enough information, he would plan the attack with the same level of patience and precision he used in every other part of his ritual, right down to the weapon he would use to bash the man's skull in. Arthur typically chose a location that was a part of the victim's everyday life, maybe the man's workplace or some other place he went frequently where Arthur knew he could catch him alone. By selecting a familiar setting, Arthur was making sure the victim would feel relatively safe and that his guard would be lowered. He remembered when the target went into isolated areas without drawing any attention. After entering the building or location ahead of time, Arthur would wait for the right moment. One, when the victim was in a secluded area and everyone else was preoccupied with something else, so no one could witness what was about to happen. When it was finally time for the attack, Arthur was more brutal than ever. Unlike the earlier murders in the cycle, this killing was incredibly violent and fueled by unadulterated rage. He always used some blunt object to beat the victim to death, hitting the man repeatedly until his head caved in. Once the victim was dead, Arthur left the body where it fell, making no effort to conceal the crime scene, but also not leaving behind any trace evidence that linked it back to himself. And the murder itself was actually the second part of this stage. Before carrying out the final kill in his cycle, Arthur had to recreate the feelings he experienced when he dealt with his father. First, he would sit down for a drink with a photograph of his father and an empty chair placed across from him. It's an eerie and uncomfortable moment, suggesting Arthur was pretending to share a drink with his late dad, the man he believed had ruined their family. For the next crucial step, Trinity had to provoke someone into physically attacking him. Arthur intentionally sought out a confrontation that would result in him being beaten down by another man. This pain served a psychological purpose, but unlike with the shower, it wasn't meant to punish him. Instead, this pain reignited the anger and resentment he felt toward his abusive father. By recreating that sense of humiliation and rage, Arthur worked himself up, making sure he remembered what his dad used to do to him, and that he was angry enough to go through with the bludgeoning. During his final successful kill cycle in Miami, Arthur waited in a dark alley outside of a bar. When a large man who was alone and drunk enough walked past, Arthur began insulting him until the stranger lost his temper and attacked him. After the random guy beat the shit out of him for the insults, Arthur yelled that everything was his fault, speaking as though the stranger actually was his father and responsible for what happened already to his sister and his mom and what was about to happen next. It was so creepy, the drunk guy didn't even bother to keep hitting Arthur, figuring he was crazy and deciding to just walk away. After provoking that confrontation and channeling his anger, Arthur was always ready to go forward with what he needed to do next. He tracked down the man he had already selected as his target and carried out the bludgeoning, which closed out the cycle. Once the cycle ended, Arthur returned to his normal life as though nothing had happened. In his little suburban neighborhood, the Trinity killer was invisible. He looked like a devoted husband, a caring father, and a respected member of the community. To the people who saw him out and about every day, he just looked like a helpful teacher who always volunteered for charity and helped support the church as a deacon. They would have never guessed that behind that carefully constructed facade was a man who had just murdered 4 people, including an innocent child. Trinity was almost a master of disguise, and that is the main way he avoided drawing suspicion, but it wasn't the only way. At each stage, he made seemingly small or random decisions that made sure he was never caught. That's what made it all work perfectly for as long as it did. Although with Lundy's guidance, investigators were able to slowly realize that Trinity's crimes were not random acts of violence, but part of a structured and repetitive cycle. It's not hard to see why no one ever thought of it before. For instance, there was the time frame he worked within. Because Arthur worked as a school teacher, that work schedule determined when his killing cycles could take place for the most part. During the school year, he maintained the appearance of a normal life, but once summer vacation began, he had the freedom to travel. That freedom allowed him to carry out his ritual in different cities across the country without blowing his cover because his work was never interrupted. No inquiries from his employers or co-workers. Not only that, but by constantly moving each cycle from one location to another, Trinity never drew too much attention to any single area. By leaving town once the final murder was completed, Trinity avoided building a long-term pattern anywhere. This constant movement prevented investigators from seeing the full scope of his crimes, making him one of the most elusive serial killers the FBI and the Miami Metro Homicide Department ever encountered, and this was bolstered by how random every stage seemed. One of the main reasons the ritual works is that each stage appears completely unrelated to the others. By the time investigators discovered the body in the bathtub, there was nothing linking the second victim's death to the disappearance of the boy in the first stage. As a result, the first 2 crimes were never connected. It was as if they were just 2 random unfortunate events in whatever city he was operating in, and making the woman jump on her own wasn't done just to make the death more closely mirror his mother's suicide. It also helped Arthur get away with the murder. Because of the way the women fell, there were no indicators of foul play. If he pushed or threw his victims off the roof, they would land differently, and the police would know they had a murder on their hands. But because the woman jumped, it looked like a clear-cut suicide every time. That meant there would be no investigation, and Arthur got away scot-free every single time. This small detail was one of the reasons Trinity was able to maintain his pattern for so many years without being caught. And just think about the people targeted in each stage. Trinity's cycle involves 4 very different crimes: the abduction and burial of a young boy, the murder of a woman in her bathtub, the forced suicide of a mother with 2 children, and the bludgeoning of a man who also has a family. Because the victims differ in age, gender, and circumstances, the crimes do not naturally appear connected. but most serial killers almost always target the same type of victim over and over again. It could be all sex workers, only homeless people, exclusively children, only people of a certain race or religious group. Whatever it may be, there is almost always a common thread that makes all of the victims similar in most serial killer cases. Law enforcement agencies typically investigate each case separately, assuming they are dealing with unrelated incidents rather than a single serial killer, unless there is something to indicate otherwise, and for most of his history, Trinity's victims didn't seem to have anything in common, not even where they lived. Most importantly, Trinity's ritual works because he follows it with strict discipline. It was very important to him that everything was done correctly. Every step of the cycle was so personal to him that he needed it to happen perfectly. The only thing he ever left behind was intentional. After each murder, he would leave a smudge of his sister Vera's ashes near the body and point the victim's arm in that direction as if they were pointing at it. Besides that, there was nothing, and that speaks to the ritual's efficiency. The personal significance meant that he had to repeat the pattern consistently and maintain control over both his urges and the crime scenes he created. His obsession led to such a high attention to detail that he never slipped up even once, despite brutally slaughtering people for 3 decades. What he was able to get away with is truly unlike any other killer Dexter ever went after. When it comes to serial killers' rituals, Trinity's is in a class all its own. Even if it was only by one man, the fact that he was ever found out at all is nothing short of a miracle. But what do you think? Was Trinity an evil mastermind, or was he just extremely lucky? Should the police have been able to catch him sooner? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like this deep dive, check out our video breaking down every part of Dexter's ritual. / that subscribe button before you go if you like our weekly ritual of breaking down everything Dexter. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.